All right, hello to all my friends joining us in our recording. Today is March 26th, and for today's office hours, we are going to focus on what we would have been doing in lab this week. So labeled the week 11 packet, or it's currently labeled the week 11 packet in the student Google Drive. We're talking about nervous tissue, we are talking about bones, muscles, and joints of the lower limb. So let me open up the floor to my friends who are here in class. If you can do me a favor, shoot me in a message. What are the particular things about this week's packet that you want me to spend the most time on? Where are the areas that we're most interested in getting some insight from Dr. Aulis? Let's start with that. Movements, definitely. Absolutely. I was planning to spend a lot of time on the movement stuff because that is a good one for us to spend a lot of time on. Okay. And that's when it's good too that I have my skeleton friend here and you have your bodies at home. So that's perfect. Okay, neuron classifications, definitely. We can take some time to talk about that. And what I will say too is lesson number 10, which is about neurons. That's posted for you, and that is going to talk not about the structural classifications of the neurons, but definitely the functional classifications as well. So it'll tie in really well with what is going on in lecture next week. Origins and insertions, we can definitely spend some good time talking about that on the exam when we take the final exam. Origins and insertion stuff is going to kind of be your critical thinking or your prediction type questions. So we'll definitely spend some good time on origins and insertions. Labeling some of the stuff from the leg. Okay. So I'm getting a lot of feedback that what we mainly want to spend our time on is probably the second half of the packet, which I totally get and approve of, because you have really good resources in the guided lab activity to help you with some of the other labeling stuff. So I'm going to focus my time today probably on working through the muscle type stuff, working through the movements and the origins and the insertions. We will definitely have time to talk about the neuron classifications as well. So I will come back to that. What I think I'm going to do with you guys is we're actually going to go ahead and we'll start kind of toward the end of the packet. We'll start with muscles, and then we'll work our way back from there. By the way, I didn't get a lot of mention of this. The stuff related to joints, I think it's pretty straightforward, so I may not take a lot of time on it, but is there anyone that really wanted help with the joints? It's really just the names of the bones that come together at places. So I may not take a lot of time on those joints, but we have that option too. So let me go and, yes, naming the joints really does give away their location. Absolutely. And what I would have told you guys if you were in class with me in lab this week too, is there are some things in the packet that you do have to memorize. Like, for example, the location of specific bone markings. That's like I have to memorize this. The page with the names of the joints, that would be a page that I tell you guys, like, honestly, don't memorize, just think your way through. So there's tips for you in the guided activity to help you figure out where the joints are located. So using the words that are in the joint names to help you find them. The joint name the joint locations, I don't think will be terrible if you just do your critical thinking. Yeah, the bone markings Eileen mentioned are definitely a little bit more challenging. And so we'll talk about some of them. Be thinking for me, if you can, about specific bone markings that maybe you're having a hard time finding. Make a list. I'll have you send them in for me a little bit later. But I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to start with muscles. So let me pull up. See if it'll work for me. Okay. These are the pictures that you have in your lab packet. Let me get to a good view here. All right, so we'll pull him up. I'm going to hold up my little friend here just because I know you've all missed him. So here's my muscle man friend. He's going to wave at you as best as he can, right? So here's Muscle Man live from Dr. Ollis's house. Don't tell anyone, but after class today, I might let my daughter play with him. She'd be really happy to play with him today. So what we are focusing on today with Muscle Man is two main parts of him. So we didn't talk a lot about this during our class time together, but let me make sure I can see on my camera here. This upper part of the lower, in normal person terms, we would call the lower limb the leg, right? When we are talking about anatomical terms, when we're being more correct, this upper part of the leg is called the thigh. So when we talk about thigh muscles, that's everything from about your hip to your kneecap. That's the thigh. Down below the knee, so the knee down to the foot, that is the region in anatomy that we actually call the leg. So if you notice in the packet, you're like, why aren't they just calling it the leg, right? It's the lower limb. Well, it's because we technically have two parts. The upper part up here being the thigh region, and then down below it being the leg region. So when you're learning the muscles of these regions, we are working on figuring out muscles not only that live in your thigh, but also muscles that live in that lower part called the leg. So help me out in the chat. Can you tell me if there were some particular muscles that we had a hard time finding? Let me start there. What were some of the muscles? Let's start with muscles on the front side of the body. So on the side for my list over here, were there any in particular that we wanted to make sure that we checked our locations on? Which of those, if any, of those muscles gave us a little trouble? We can talk about those. Pectineus is not on your list to have to know. So if it's not on your list to have to know, you don't have to study it. So don't worry about pectineus. Only worry about the ones that are here on our list. Okay, extensor digitorum longus. Yep, we can talk about that one. The adductor group. Okay, yep. So, and you can keep, by the way, if yours hasn't been mentioned yet, please feel free to send it in. So let me start with the adductor group up here at the top. When we talk about adductor group, what you might see this labeled as in various places would be adductor longus, adductor brevis. Adductor group is a group of muscles. Rather than having you specify which particular adductor you're looking at, we just want you to know that the adductors are living together kind of in a group. Now, I know it's been a little while since we last had lab and since we last talked about muscle actions, but the name of this muscle, this adductor word here, tells us what it does. This muscle does a movement called adduction. When we talk about adduction, does anyone remember what we said that movement was? Yeah, Carrie's got an idea for us. Adduction. The example that I gave to the students that I was able to attend class with, adduction is when the aliens try to abduct me away. They try to steal me away, so my arms are going up. This is abduction. Me. But when I say I have to be added back down, adduction is when things come back toward the midline of the body. So we're going to put toward midline here. Toward midline, adduction. Now, I'll mention for you another example that I gave in class before spring break. Everybody go ahead and hold up a hand. And I know you're going to feel really weird doing it at home, right? We can have one of those moments like they always have like on movies, right? Where like they put their hands up together and like, I can't touch you, but I'm touching you. So we're touching from a distance, right? Because, hey, social distancing, it's no joke, right? Okay, here's our hands. We're all having a moment. If you put your fingers together, if we start like this, when I spread my fingers out like this, I move them away from my midline here in the middle. When you spread your fingers out, that is abduction. When I pull them all back together, that is adduction. So adduction, we can either be moving a limb, something big like your entire leg, like we see on our picture here, toward the middle of the body. So pulling it in toward the middle of the body. Or we can do it with something as small as just your fingers. So adducting the fingers back together. Again, we just acted out adduction. Highly recommend that with each of the actions that we're doing this week, with each of these muscles, do act them out so you have an idea of what they feel like. So when I talk about the adductor group, it's a group of muscles that their job is to bring the thigh portion, which will move the entire lower limb, back toward the middle. The adductor group, the biggest one that I can see is right here. And I apologize, my arrow is a little bit funky. But this big muscle that you see right here, we find it on the medial side of the leg. So medial, meaning we are in the middle. When we start talking about actions, one of the things I'll tell you with those actions is things that live in the middle of the thigh that are found here toward the midline, they are going to do adduction, where they bring things together. They're bringing it back to the midline. So the adductor group is this big muscle that we see here in the middle. Let me try to remember. I'm going to pull up my chat here really fast. We asked about, okay, extensor digitorum longus and adductor. I think those are the main ones we asked about. So let me label a few other ones to help us find our extensor digitorum. I want to start with, let me get my little marker out here. Let's start with this one right here. In the chat, help me out. This is the muscle on the back side of your leg. Ladies, this is the muscle that looks really good in heels. We're trying to show off back here. My big one back here, yeah, a few of us are recognizing it. This big one back here, like I said, you're showing off in heels, is called gastrocnemius. Hey, props to you all for spelling that right. Oh my goodness, that's a big one, right? So gastrocnemius, that is the muscle that I find on the back side of your leg back there. Tucked in right behind it, or right underneath it, maybe that's more accurate. The muscle right underneath it is called soleus. Soleus. Soleus lives right underneath gastrocnemius. So when you're trying to identify the location of those two, the one that's on the outside that you can feel, that again, here let's use our anatomy word. When you plantar flex your foot, meaning you point your toes down, that's what makes gastrocnemius look so pronounced. Gastrocnemius is the one on the very back, and then right next to it, or right kind of underneath it, is the one called soleus. These muscles, gastrocnemius and soleus, we find those guys on the back side. When we are talking about extensor digitorum, I'm going to consult my friend the Google, just like I would have done in class, to show you guys where it is. Give me a minute. I'm going to find a really awesome picture, and then we'll translate that into our screen here. All right, let me switch screens on you. Chrome tab, this one. Okay, so check out my picture over on the right. When we are talking about muscles that live on the front side, so we had gastrocnemius on the back. You can see it labeled on the left side of my picture. Gastrocnemius in the back. They don't have it labeled, but we've got our little tiny soleus that'd be right in front of it. On the very front side of the leg, there on the very front, we have two muscles that we want to know. The first one we want to know is called extensor digitorum longus. That's the one we were actually looking for, right? And next door neighbors to it is what we call tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior was one of those muscles, remember when we talked about naming rules, that this muscle has the name of a bone inside of it. Not a trick question. Tibialis anterior. What bone is tibialis anterior on top of? Yeah, we're all getting it. That's the tibia, right? It's on top of the tibia, absolutely. So the two main muscles you want to know on the front side of the leg, extensor digitorum longus and tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior being the one that's closer to the tibia. So let me go back then, and I'm going to share our picture, and we're going to find together. Bear with me. Down here. We're back. Okay. We're back here. We are looking on the front side. So the space in particular, I guess I'm as zoomed in as I can be. The space in particular where we're looking for both the tibialis anterior that we talked about, as well as the one we're trying to find, extensor digitorum longus. Here are my two muscles that are going to represent these guys. They're on the very front side of the leg. I can see them right here. So I'm going to draw some lines. Got a line over here and a line over here. And I'm going to put some numbers. We're going to call this one number 1, and we're going to call this one number 2. In the chat, help me out. When I talk about muscle number 1, based on the picture that we looked at, muscle number 1, is that going to be my extensor digitorum longus, or is that going to be tibialis anterior, based on the picture we looked at before? Yes. Yeah, we're texting in. That's going to be my extensor muscle. It's the one that's more lateral, to use our directional terms. So extensor, that's a long name, right? Props to you guys who typed me the whole thing. Digitorum longus. That's this one over here on the side, which means that the one that's a little bit more medial, the one that's right on top of the tibia, is tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior. Now, technically, if we look over at the other side over here, we can also still see the muscle that's right on top of the tibia. We can still see the medial one. If I was going to label and I am not going to use this view to label the particular muscle. So this is not the view that I would put on the exam for you. But if I were to use this particular view, which muscle does my line over here on the side relate to? Can we tell? It's the one that's medial. Which one might this one be over here? Yeah, Lars voting tibialis. Yep, got a couple of votes for tibialis. Yeah, this again is not my best view of tibialis anterior, but it is the tibialis anterior because it's the one that's more medial right on top of the tibia. We can see the tibia really well here. So big idea that we've mentioned. The two main ones on the front side of the leg are the extensor digitorum longus and the tibialis anterior. Tibialis more medial, extensor digitorum longus more lateral, farther toward the outside. By the way, the name of extensor digitorum longus, this is another one that its name tells me what it does. So this is an extensor. It gets a little bit funky when we're talking about flexors and extensors in the foot. We're going to talk about some movements here, but extensor means it's going to help me to extend something. In particular, this digitorum word means the toes or the digits. So this is a muscle that I find down here in the legs. Its job is to help me control the movement of the toes all the way down here in the feet. So extensor digitorum longus, it's going to have these little white lines that you see down here in the foot. Those are actually a lot of the tendons of where it goes to attach to things. So extensor digitorum longus right there next to tibialis anterior. Were there any other muscles on this particular view over here on the left that we wanted to go over, or were we able to find most of those other ones? Okay, all good. I got a question about sartorius. We can definitely talk about sartorius. Most of the other ones, yeah, most of the other ones are a little bit easier to find, but definitely my leg muscles, they were smaller. Let me draw a few lines here, and I'm going to make you guys help me figure out which one is sartorius. So let's draw some lines. Okay, asking about gracilis. Okay, so I'm going to draw some lines here. Let's see. Okay, and I'm going to put some numbers so that we can all talk about the same thing. Okay, so here's a number 1. We're going to call this one number 2, number 3, number 4. All right, let's do some talking about muscles here. One, two, 3, or 4. Which of those is sartorius? Can we tell which one is sartorius? Yeah, Carrie, Rosa, we're voting number 1. Yep, Kathleen voting number 1. That is correct. So I'm going to draw a line. Oops, I got to notice that my connection's not doing great. I apologize. Are we back? Is the screen coming in a little bit better? It froze for a minute. It's not loading. We're good now. Okay. Yeah, it sent me a notice on my end that for some reason I bugged. So that's what happens when I have to do sessions from home. So I'm glad I'm back now. Okay. Let me draw for you on the screen. I'm going to highlight all of sartorius. So I'm on sartorius in yellow here. We can see it over here on the leg that we labeled it, number 1, sartorius. You can also see it though, and I could have labeled it over on the other leg. You can actually kind of see it better over here. The sartorius muscle is one that reaches around from the outside of your hip all the way down to the inside of your knee. So when you take your foot, the best way I can think about is like, you know, in the movies when they're like dancing an Irish jig and they like tap their foot in front of them when they're having a drinking party. Shows you, I don't watch much TV, right? I've got real bad analogies, but when you raise your foot up to tap the inside of your hand onto your foot, this is the muscle that helps you do that. So it attaches on the very outside of your hip and it goes down to the inside of your knee. That's sartorius. Sartorius is actually the longest muscle in the body. So sartorius, that's number 1 for me. We also asked about gracilis. Can anyone help me out? Our options are 2, 3, and 4. Can we tell which one is gracilis? Options are 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, I'm getting some votes for 3. That is correct. Yep. Gracilis is another long muscle here in the middle. So here's gracilis. I highlighted it in green for us. I kind of over-highlighted. I apologize. But gracilis found here on the inside. We will see that one a little bit better in another view. But there's gracilis there on the inside. It's that straight line muscle that we see there. I had a question about vastus medialis and vastus lateralis. The question was, are they on either side of rectus femoris? And the answer to that question is yes. So let me get my little typer out here. This muscle I have labeled as number 2 is rectus femoris. Rectus femoris, that word rectus means that it's parallel to the middle of the body. So this muscle, or parallel, excuse me, to a region. So this muscle runs straight up and down on your thigh region here. It attaches to the top, attaches down at the bottom. Rectus femoris. Vastus lateralis is on the lateral side of this muscle. Vastus medialis is the one on the medial side. So what we've talked about is sartorius muscle. That was number 1. We've talked about the rectus femoris muscle. That's parallel on the top of the thigh. We mentioned these 2 that are next to it on the lateral and the medial sides. Those are our vastus muscles. And then tucked in more on the back side, but I can kind of see it right here. That's my gracilis muscle right here. So we hit most of the muscles here on the anterior or the front side of the lower limb. Let's scoot over to the back side. When we're on, let's see, do we have to know what each of the muscles do or just their location and identify them? You should not memorize what each of these muscles do. You should use their locations and your ability to identify where they are to predict what they do. So we're going to spend some good time in office hours today learning how to make those kinds of predictions. So don't look up on Google exactly what these muscles do. Do not memorize that. That's worthless. I'll show you how we can use their locations to figure out what they do. is on movement but is not labeled. So that would be a typo. I will make a note of that. We do want to know where semimembranosus is. I apologize. That we must have lost that one when we did a revision label. Thank you for telling me that, Carrie. We'll get that fixed. Since we don't have it on your list for labeling, we'll point out where it is, so you can label it for your own reference, but I'll make sure we don't put that on an exam for us. So we're looking here at the back side of the leg. Let's talk about a couple of them that we have already labeled when we were on the front side. So this one right here is the one that looks good in heels. What muscle is this one that I pointed out here on the back? We can actually see it on both sides, label it on both sides. Yep, there's gastrocnemius there. And then we'll switch colors. Right underneath gastrocnemius. Again, I can see it on both sides. Who did we say lived underneath? Yep, Carrie's voting soleus. That is correct. We've got gastrocnemius, yep, and then my soleus muscle. So that takes care of a couple of them that we were labeling on here. We all know where gluteus maximus is, right? So gluteus maximus is the big one in your gluteal region. I will point out for you gluteus medius is its upstairs neighbor, if you will. The muscle here, and let me grab my muscle man again. On the muscle man, when we're looking at the gluteal region, gluteus maximus, we can see that really well. Next to it, a little bit lighter color because it's actually covered in some connective tissue. That's where gluteus medius is. So gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, both of those guys up there. Semitendinosus and semimembranosus are next door neighbors to each other. So I'm going to consult my friend the Google really fast to get you a good picture of the two of them. And then we'll translate that, onto our picture. We'll try this. We'll try this one here and see if it helps us out. All right. So we got some extra things. Here's the ones we just talked about. Gluteus medius, the little one, gluteus maximus, the big one. We are looking for semitendinosus and semimembranosus. And again, Carrie reminded me we don't technically have membranosus on our list. It would be good for you to know where it is, but I'm going to specifically ask you to identify it. Just know that it's on the backside. So we have this muscle right here, semitendinosus or semimembranosus. Sorry, not enough coffee. Semitendinosus is right here, not labeled. Okay, kind of labeled on my picture. We have a big one called biceps femoris. So the two big ones that we want to know, biceps femoris and semitendinosus, those are the ones that we can easily identify. Semimembranosus is really small and harder to see, but it lives right next door to semitendinosus. And then that muscle that we were labeling, by the way, on the front side that we could see, the one in the very middle is gracilis. So from the middle, we have gracilis, then the little tiny semimembranosus, the much bigger semitendinosus, and then biceps femoris. So here's my labeled Google image. Let's flip back to our picture. Man, there's got to be a faster way. I got to click like 5 screens. It's all good. We got time. Here. Okay, so we said when we were looking on the inside that, or when we were looking at our labeled picture, that the one on the very outside, does anyone remember the name of the one that's on the very outside of the thigh? What was that big one on the outside called? Yeah, Rosa's got it right for us. We're chiming in here. That is the biceps femoris. The big one toward the outside is biceps femoris. Next to biceps femoris, the other big one along the backside of the thigh, this is semitendinosus. Semitendinosus right next to the biceps. So let me pull up muscle man again. When we look at the side of muscle man, try to make sure we're in the right place on the camera here. On the back side of the muscle man, the two big ones that you see on muscle man, the medial one is semitendinosus. The lateral one is biceps femoris. I just remembered, Carrie, we actually purposely didn't have you memorize the location or identify the semimembranosus because it's so small. We can't really see it. So that's why it didn't make the list. We can really only see tendinosus and biceps femoris. That's why we didn't include that. I think somebody asked me if I'm using the pictures from the lab packet. I am. Let me look at the question specifically. Oh, in the lab final, will you be using the pictures? Correct. Yes, since we are not in person, either we're going to use the exact pictures in the lab packet, or I've got Muscleman, so I might flag him and take pictures that show things a little bit better. But yes, since we are not in person, I am not going to have a model, obviously, out in front of you. I can't visit all your houses, right? We gotta stay together in separate. So. Yes, yeah. So general rule, I'll say with these muscles, whatever view you can see the muscles best in, that's what we're going to try to tag them in. So I am not going to, let's see, there were some things over here, like I mentioned last time. I am not, when we were over here on the other model, this is probably not the view I'm going to use. The line I just drew over there, that's not the view I'm going to use for tibialis anterior. If I'm going to ask you about tibialis anterior, I'm going to ask you about it where it's clear on the other side. So you can see most of these muscles, not always, but I'm going to pick whatever view is the easiest to see them in. So make sure we can identify where they are. And again, if you can feel their general locations on your body, you're in good shape because you can use your body when you take that exam. All right, so that is, let me see what my next page is. We zoom in a little bit closer on the next one. Okay, yeah, we did not label fibularis, did we? Okay, so let's go back. Fibularis actually we'll probably see better on this one here. So let me go. Fibularis is easiest to see on the outside. So I'm down on muscles of the lateral leg that we're going to look at now here. So the easiest way to identify fibularis longus is its name. Tell me what bone it's on top of. So blow up my chat for me. Fibularis longus is on top of the fibula. Yep, not a trick question. Okay, so the fibula, when you're feeling on yourself, we've got the tibia toward the middle and the fibula toward the outside. So when I'm looking at my foot here, see this line muscle right here. This muscle right here, it extends down. I can see here's its tendon going down into the foot. This muscle here on the very outside, that is fibularis longus. So the one that's very lateral. I'll mention, oh, I guess we did actually have you labeling it. This one right here is the gastrocnemius, the one that we said looks good in heels. This one right underneath it is peroneus, or excuse me, not peroneus, soleus. Ask me about peroneus. In a lot of the pictures that you're seeing labeled, they will call fibularis longus peroneus. I will put both names on the exam because you can find it both ways. It's the same muscle, peroneus and fibularis longus. So the way that you see it labeled right here, or that we're asking you to learn it, I will give you both of those names. So from the back side, let me get my pointer. From the back side, here on the leg, we have gastrocnemius. Right in front of gastrocnemius, we have the muscle called soleus. Those were the two on the back side. All the way lateral on your leg down here on top of the fibula is fibularis longus. Then we've got two muscles. Let me draw my little lines here. 1 and 2. This muscle that I have right here, the second line that I drew, this was the muscle from the front of the leg that we said was more lateral. Was it tibialis or was it the extensor that was more lateral? Who was more lateral? Yeah, I got a few votes coming in here. The extensor was the one that was more lateral. And remember, its name was extensor digitorum. If you look at this muscle right here, see all these little tendons, these little white lines that are going down into the feet, down to those digits. So extensor digitorum, we're going down into the digits or into the toes. That's this muscle right here. And again, I can't see it super well, but here's my little tibialis anterior. So that to say, I'm not going to use this particular picture to ask you to identify tibialis anterior, because it's much easier to see on the front side of the leg. So the tibialis anterior is the one at the very beginning, the one on the very left. Next to it is extensor digitorum. Next to extensor digitorum is fibularis longus. Next to that is soleus, all the way to the back to gastrocnemius. Those are our muscles that we can see on the lateral side of the leg. Is there a muscle in between fibularis longus and tibialis anterior? Oh, there are lots of muscles, yes, that kind of are found in between those places, underneath those places. Yes, there would be other muscles that are found in this region. You do not need to know them. If it would help you to understand a little bit better, there's not any. So there's kind of the beginnings of part of one right here, and we can see some of the deeper muscles perhaps right here, but there's not one that we're labeling. We're not labeling that one in particular. Yeah. So just worry about the ones that we told you on that list. That's what we're going to focus on. Yeah. Okay. So here's the big idea with muscle identifications. Some notes maybe to make for yourself about muscle IDs. We want to know where the muscles live. To get an idea of what I mean by that, when we start looking at actions, it's going to say muscles that live on the anterior side of the thigh, or muscles that live on the lateral side of the thigh. When you are working on learning these muscles, you want to know, would I call this an anterior muscle? Would I call this a posterior muscle? Would I call this a lateral muscle? Would I call it a medial muscle? If you are learning their locations in the pictures, so I'll zoom out again. If we're learning their general locations, if I can identify them in a picture, and maybe more importantly, if you can point to where they are on yourself, on your own body, use that to help you get an idea of their general locations. So anterior, posterior, lateral, and medial. On the feet, yeah, we're going to talk about sartorius with the femur movement. Yes, so we'll get there with sartorius, because that one's a little bit tricky. He travels all over the place, right? So we'll talk about that. Any last minute ID questions before we move on? I will mention for you too, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them up. I'll mention that the guided learning activity has some links for you. I believe it has some links to some websites that show you these muscles by themselves. But if it doesn't, go into the student Google Drive and look at those supplemental resources, because there's some great resources to show you these muscles by themselves, and at least one of those resources shows you what it does when they contract. So that's kind of cool. Yeah, so Carrie's saying there is a link there in that guided resources. Excellent. If not, go into the Google Drive, because you still have access to those things related to muscles. All right, so let's see. Okay, so that brings us to movements. And I got a lot of questions about movements. So unless there are any objections, we'll go ahead and truck on into movements. Again, I'll give you your last chance. Any other muscle ID questions? Got a thumbs up. Yeah, awesome. I'm telling you, man, I really miss the whole in class where I just say, all right, thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs middle. I miss that. So it's the little things, right? I feel like what we figure out when we go online is like the little like idiosyncrasies of the things that we did in class every day that we can't do anymore. So we can get all nostalgic and think about class, right? I know that it's a sad face for sure. we did have a great class. We had a lot of fun together. So we're making the most of it, right? Seriously, like we're going to have to schedule at the very end of the semester. Like I'm going to schedule an office hour. Like literally we can all get like a little glass to raise to each other. We can do a virtual raising a glass of something. Mine will definitely be grape juice. Although here, I'm going to be a little too personal with you guys here. Man, since I've been pregnant, I don't drink wine like ever, but since I've been pregnant, and especially with the state of the world now, right? I'm like, oh my gosh, I need some wine. So I always, before I stopped going grocery shopping, we had this conversation yesterday. I don't go grocery shopping anymore because, you know, not smart to be out. But I would always joke with my husband, like, hey, we need to pick up a bottle of wine today. And he would always say, no, we're not getting wine today. Yeah, Carrie mentioned after I give birth, absolutely. Maybe we can schedule another another office hour for after I give birth, and we can all raise our little glass of wine. So there we go. Well, yeah, and that's kind of what I tried to tell my husband, right? That just one glass, it's going to be okay. But yeah, I am due at the end of May. So have some time after class is done to kind of try to settle and prepare for that. Hopefully time for the virus to stop being so crazy, right? I'm wanting, selfishly, I'm wanting the stuff to peak here in Texas. Here, I'm reading some things like 3 weeks from now. I'm like, yeah, let's do that, because then I still got, you know, like 6 weeks before my baby's born for things to calm down a little bit. So yeah, end of May is the due date. So, all right. Rosa had a question on the anterior and lateral view. Is the fibularis longus kind of hidden underneath extensor digitorum, anterior and lateral? Yeah, we can only see it just, it's not hidden underneath them, it is next to them. Let me draw a little line for us here. The best that we can see, I'm going to kind of circle the general region of it. This is my general region of fibularis over here. The part I know for sure is fibularis is this white tendon right here. So that's the best fibularis that I can see angle. But again, I'll mention for you guys that that's not my best view of fibularis longus, so that is not going to be the view that I'm going to use on the exam. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that the view you're seeing of a muscle is the best way for you to identify it. So I'm going to do fibularis over here, because I can definitely see fibularis best over here. All right, so let's talk muscle movements. With muscle movements, I said this briefly before, and I'm going to emphasize it again. And maybe even you should probably write this down. If we were in class, I would say this. I would say underline it, star this. Do not memorize what these muscles do. My thing I would tell you guys to write down and underline, highlight, star is do not memorize what these muscles do. Because we have to memorize the locations of bone markings. Like there's no other way for us to do that. We just have to have those memorized. But when it comes to the kinds of movements that a muscle can do, we do not have to memorize those. What I would tell you guys to memorize for each of these different movement things, they each have a little rule. So here we are on your section on the worksheet that says muscles that move the femur. The first rule that you see is what I just put brackets around right here. So the first rule, what I do want you to memorize when you're working on muscle movements, is that muscles that live on the anterior and the medial sides of the thigh flex the thigh, or flex the femur, excuse me. Muscles that live on the anterior side and the medial side of the thigh are going to do flexion. And muscles that live on the posterior side of the thigh are going to do extension of the femur. So what I want you to memorize is the general locations. And hey, remember I told you guys to use your body. So like literally, I hope that some of you, if not most of you, are putting your hands on the front side, the top of your thighs. That's anterior, the front side, and telling yourself out loud, or at least in your head, that the muscles up here do flexion. And then put your hands on the middle side of your thigh and say, these are the muscles that do flexion of the femur. And then put your hands on the back side of your thigh. These are the ones that do extension. If you know generally that all my muscles that live on the top and on the middle are going to do flexion of the femur, and if you know the ones that live on the back side do extension, you're good. If you memorize that, then we can just use the location of these muscles to figure out what they do. So let me see if I can figure out an easy way to do this here. We're going to go through our list, and I'm going to make some markings on our list here. So we're going to say that things that I put a blue line next to, those are things that live on the anterior and the medial side of the thigh. And things that I put a red mark next to, these are going to be muscles that live on the posterior side of the thigh. This would be the way that if we were in class, this is how we would talk about this stuff. So let's go through our muscle list here, and we're going to mark whether this is an anterior and medial muscle or whether it's posterior muscle. So probably the easiest way to do this, let's go through, and we're going to start with my muscles here on the left. My muscles here on my little left column right here. Do me a favor in the chat. All I want you to type for me is we're going to make a list. So I want you to make me a list that says 1, whether it's anterior or posterior. So you'll do 1 dash, let me show you what I'm thinking here. So 1 dash, well here, I'll give you our first one here. The adductor group, that one's kind of anterior and medial. Anterior, medial. And then right next to it, you'll do 2. I'm not going to give you 2. See what I just put in the chat there? Number 1 is anterior and medial. Number 2, biceps femoris. Tell me, is that one an anterior and medial or a posterior? Gluteus maximus, anterior, posterior. Rectus femoris, anterior, posterior. Let's see if I can get some feedback from a few of you here. Try to type up for me. And if you don't know where all of them are, that's fine. Just give me the numbers that you do know here. So we'll call this 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you want to vote for me, some of these things. Nicole, if you can't see my markings, try refreshing your page. That seemed to help some people yesterday. So if you hit the refresh button, it'll kick you out and kick you back in. All right, so I got some votes coming in. That's perfect. And again, if you just want to vote on a couple of them, that totally works too. We don't have to vote on them all. I said that I was going to mark my posteriors with red. So I'm scanning my votes here, and I'm seeing a lot of votes for biceps femoris. Oops, get my marker back. Biceps femoris being posterior. That is correct. Remember, biceps femoris, that is one of those big muscles on the back. That's the lateral big muscle on the back. I am also seeing a lot of votes for us that gluteus maximus is on the posterior side. That is correct. Remember, that's the one in the gluteal region. So gluteus maximus here, that lives on the back side. The adductor group is the one that I gave you. I told you that one, technically, if we were going to pick a word for it, I'd probably use medial for it, but it doesn't matter, anterior and medial. That's this guy here, adductor. And rectus femoris, number 4, I saw quite a few votes that one was also an anterior muscle. That's the big anterior muscle on the front. Perfect. Okay, so let's do lightning round here. Let's do to help us go faster. You tell me if I'm giving you the name of a muscle that's anterior, A. If it's medial, give me M. If it's posterior, give me P. So here we go, lightning round. The muscle, oh, I guess this is the one you were asking about, wasn't it, Carrie? Sartorius. Give me some votes here. Sartorius, what letter do we think that one is? Is that A, M, or P? Sartorius muscle. Do you remember that guy? Perfect. Yep, I got a lot of A's. That is correct. We could say that sartorius is anterior or medial, probably. Let me pull up my friend here. I'd probably say if I was going to pick just one of them, I would probably say here's sartorius, right? Let me make sure we're in the right place here. Here's sartorius, up and down. I would probably say anterior on that one too. So this is an anterior muscle here that goes from the top to the bottom, anterior muscle at an angle. So anterior, I was labeling blue. That one labeled blue. Semimembranosus, that was the one that we talked about, that I told you we didn't have to label, but it lives right next to semitendinosus. What letter would we say for semitendinosus and membranosus? Yeah, I'm getting a lot of posteriors or P's. Absolutely. Both of these guys, tendinosus and membranosus, they live next to each other On the back side. Okay, got it, Carrie. This is for the next one. Perfect. Okay, first step that I always recommend you do with these muscle movement things is we start by doing this. Are you on the front side? Are you on the back side? Are you on the medial side when we're talking about moving the femur? So I've gone through and color-coded all of my muscles now. Now that I've color-coded my muscles, I can use this rule that we gave you guys at the beginning to figure out what these muscles are doing. So any of the muscles that I said were a blue muscle, that were on the anterior or the medial side, I know because they live on the anterior or the medial side that they do flexion. So adductor group, going to flex the femur. Rectus, flexing the sartorius, flexing the femur. Anybody that I gave a red line to is always going to be extending. Extend the femur, extend the femur, extend the femur, extend. Okay, what I will tell you on the final exam, when it comes time for that, you are going to have to give me a two-part answer for what muscles do. The first part of the answer you're going to need to give me is this muscle action word, is what I like to call these guys here with the circle. Is it something that does flexion, or is it something that does extension? The first part of your answer is either that it flexes or it extends. That's half of your answer. The second part of your answer is the bone that it's moving. So these rules that we just talked about are rules that apply to the femur bone, the big bone in your thigh. So muscles that live on the front and the middle, they're always going to flex the femur. That's our description of what they're doing. Muscles that live on the posterior side of the thigh, they're going to always extend the femur. So make sure we're not only studying, excuse me, if it is flexion or extension, make sure we are also studying what bone goes along with that. Flexion and extension and the name of the bone. So big idea to remind you, please do not go through and memorize all of these specific muscles that we just identified. Please do memorize these general rules at the top. If you memorize the general rules at the top and you know where these muscles live, you can predict their actions and you're good. So yeah, Eileen said that's awesome to figure it out. Absolutely. Yeah, that is what this activity, the best way to do these movements is to figure it out or to think it out. Please don't miss. So here's our movements of the femur. Muscles, next option here when we're talking about the femur is we can also do abduction and adduction. So let me go back. I'll do my colors kind of like we had before. Before we said that things that were medial, we said they were blue. Any muscle that is on the medial side of the thigh is going to do adduction. It's going to pull things toward the midline. We talked about adduction. Anything that lives on the lateral side of the thigh is going to do abduction. Again, this is where what we're memorizing, these rules up here, we are not memorizing actions. So we've got a list here of 4 muscles, and we need to figure out which of these are on the lateral side and which of these are on the medial side. We already talked about the adductor group together. Help me out. Did we say that adductor was medial or lateral? You can give me an M or an L. Adductor, medial or lateral? Yep, that's a medial one. That's a medial muscle. Okay. Gluteus medius, its name is a little bit tricky, right, when we're talking about its location. Gluteus medius, is that lateral or medial? Where's that one? Yeah, that one actually lives on the outside. That one's a lateral muscle, gluteus medius. Lateral, by the way, again, you got your body and you're not on camera. I'm on camera, but you're not on camera. So you can feel gluteus medius all you want and I'll never know. So that one lives on the outside of your thigh there. So gluteus medius is out there. Our question was on sartorius, right? You hurt yours. I'm sorry, Eileen. That's not a fun one to hurt. Sartorius, was the trickier one that we had a question about. Let me pull up my muscle man again. When I look at sartorius, so here it is again. Sartorius muscle here at the top, going down here. Sartorius muscle ends very much on the medial side. So notice that the sartorius muscle is very much here in the middle. Where it attaches is kind of close to the outside, but it spends most of its time here on the front, going toward the very middle of the thigh. Because of that, we're going to say that sartorius is a medial muscle. Sartorius we would consider a medial muscle. And that would be one, if that one doesn't make quite as much sense to you, just memorize that that one's a medial muscle. I would say sartorius is an anterior and a medial muscle, sartorius. And we didn't really talk about tensor fascia latae. I'll show that one off here. When I'm looking at my muscle man here, all this big white stuff that I see right here, this is what we call the fascia latae. Sounds like a really great Starbucks drink, right? Fascia latae, it's connective tissue. Tensor fascia latae is the little muscle that's up here. Tensor fascia latae, this little guy up here. So when I look at this little muscle that's right here, I'll try to keep my finger on it over here. Would we say that this muscle is lateral or medial? It lives over here. Lateral or medial? What do we think? Yep, that's going to be another lateral muscle. That's a lateral muscle. So yeah, I'm glad you guys appreciated my little Starbucks humor there for you. Got to try, right? So that's lateral. Make that one red. Okay, again, now we go back to our rules. So anybody who's underlined red, who lives on the lateral side, that's always going to be an abductor. So I've got two abductors, things that pull my femur away from the middle. I have two that I would consider adductors, the ones that I underlined blue. Adductors. This is the way that, again, that we want to approach these things. We are learning using their location to predict what they do. Do not go through and memorize this part here in the blue bracket. Don't memorize that, what they do. Memorize the general rules. If we know the general rules, that's going to help us to make these predictions. So abduction versus adduction. Are we going to the middle of the body? Are we pulling away from the body? If you think about this and feel it on yourself, the muscles that help you to pull away from the middle of the body, they've got to be on the outside of the body to be able to do that. The muscles that are going to pull me toward the middle of the body, they've got to live in the middle of the body to make that happen. So lateral versus medial helps me out with abduction and adduction. When we talk about anterior versus posterior, those muscles primarily do flexion and extension. Now, what we probably haven't emphasized enough, let me get a new color here. What I maybe haven't emphasized enough to this point is we've been talking about moving the femur. And if you've got a highlighter at home, highlight femur on these. We've been talking about moving the femur because we are about to switch into talking about the kinds of movements that these muscles do, not to the femur, but now to what they do to the tibia. It's a different ball game when we start talking about what we're doing to the tibia. So hopefully you've snapped a picture here, or you filled this in your notes, because I'm going to bounce back a slide and all my beautiful markings here, my color coding is going to go away. So give it a moment if you want to snap a picture. And then I'm going to bounce back here. In these rules right here, please also underline or highlight the femur. These are the things that these muscles do to the femur. The reason I'm making a point of saying that is because many of these muscles that we're talking about here with moving the femur also help to move the tibia. So many of the muscle names that you see on this list over here are the same. Not all of them, but many of them are the same as what we just saw. And now when we're talking about these muscles, I don't care what they do to the femur right now. What I care about is what they do to the tibia. So in your general rule now, I want you to underline, highlight, star tibia. And we're going to do just like we did before. We're going to identify anterior and we're going to identify posterior to help us out with this flexion and extension stuff. Now, let's make a note next to our rule here. Here's the note that I want you to write down next to your rule here. These movements are opposite of what it did with the femur. These movements are opposite of what they did with the femur. Let me explain what I mean by that here. When I am talking about my general rules, when we talked about muscles that lived on the anterior side of the femur, if you look up in your notes, the things that lived on the anterior side of the thigh, those flexed the femur. Things that lived on the posterior side of the thigh, those extended the femur. That's what I mean by opposite. So we need to know that if you live on the front side of the thigh, your job when it comes to moving the femur is you do flexion. Flexion of the femur, by the way, is lifting it up. But if you live in that same area, you live in the front of your thigh, you are also extending the tibia. And here's where I really encourage you, because I can't really show it to you in a way that's appropriate, right? I can't really show you this, but everybody do me a favor. Put your, so get to where you can put your knee where it's hanging straight down at a 90-degree angle. And then I want you to stick it straight out, as far out as you can stick it. That is extension of the tibia, sticking your leg straight out like that. So extension of the tibia is when I take my leg from hanging like this and I pull it up straight. That's the job of the muscles that live on the top side of the femur, extension of the tibia. If you live up here, you make the tibia go straight. But if you live up here, you also help the femur to go up as well. You flex the femur. So these are actions I want you to act out on yourself to help you understand this. If you live on top of the thigh, you move that femur up toward the body. You flex the femur. But you can also move the tibia, and the movement that you're doing with the tibia is extension. So the opposite is true then on the posterior side as well, right? So muscles that live on the posterior side, the back of the thigh, those were the ones that we said extended the femur. They're the ones that help you to pull your leg backwards, your femur backwards. But they're also the ones that when we have our leg out, like we did with the other muscles, the ones that live here on the back side are the ones that pull the tibia back down. That's my flexion of the tibia. So extension of the tibia when you straighten your leg, flexion of the tibia when you pull it back down. Please, like I said, make a note for yourself that my action words, let me get my underliner here, extension and flexion, those action words are flipped when we compare the tibia to the femur. And give that some thought, because I know that I might be blowing some of your minds right now. Give that some thought and bring questions that you have about that to office hours tomorrow, because we can talk some more about it. Let me look at my muscles here. All of these muscles here, let's do the one that you didn't have to label, but we've already talked about it. Semimembranosus. Did we say that that was an anterior or a posterior muscle? Semimembranosus. Anyone remember? So we're talking about semimembranosus. I'll point to it right here. Yep, I'm getting a whole lot of P's in the chat. Absolutely. Semimembranosus is a posterior muscle. That's the posterior muscle that lived right next door, remember, to semitendinosus. We just can't see it very well. So semimembranosus and semitendinosus, these are both on the posterior side of the thigh. So let's use our rules here. Membranosus and tendinosus, do they flex the tibia or extend the tibia? What's the action of these muscles related to the tibia? Absolutely. I'm getting a whole lot of flexion. Absolutely. Okay. So I'm going to be that mean teacher, and I'm not going to do the rest of them with you, but I know we can figure out front side versus back side on each of these muscles here, and I know you can use those rules to help you predict their actions on the tibia. So please make sure we're comparing for ourselves. Are we talking about where the femur moves? Are we talking about where the tibia moves? It all comes down to which side of the leg or where on the leg you live. So we've talked about moving the tibia. We've talked about moving the femur. Let's talk about moving the foot. When we talk about moving the foot, we have two new action words that we're talking about here, dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So if you go back to the week 8 packet, it reminds you what these movements are. And again, please act them out because that's the best way to study this stuff. So dorsiflexion is what you do when you rock back on your heels. Fun fact, my daughter loves to walk around the house on her heels. So it's super fun. She likes to dorsiflex. That's her current favorite thing to do. Dorsiflexion, so rocking back on the heels of your foot. Plantar flexion is what we're doing when we wear a pair of high heels, plantar flexion. So pushing your toes into the ground, standing up on your tiptoes, that's plantar flexion. Just like before, what action you do comes down to where you live. If you're on the front side, you're going to help with dorsiflexion. And what I mean by that is the muscles that live on the front of your leg. So if you feel down on the front side of your tibia, when you pull your toes backwards, so you got your foot flat, when you pull your toes backwards, you do dorsiflexion, you can feel the movement of the muscles there on the front side of your leg down there. So anterior muscles, the ones that live on the front, they do dorsiflexion. They help you to rock back on your heels. Muscles that live on the outside or they live on the back, those are going to be really important for plantar flexion. That's the standing up on your tiptoes or wearing a pair of heels. So one of these three muscles over here, one of these three muscles I've been talking about in heels all session today. Which of these three muscles do we say lives on the back side and would help us then with plantar flexion? What do we think? Yeah, it's totally fine. We're not typing the whole name, and I have no problem with that. That's this guy right here. Gastrocnemius. That's the one that we're all showing off in heels. Although let's be real, right? Is anybody still wearing heels right now? Like, there's no reason, right? Let's take our daily poll. How many of us are here in our pajamas today? We got some friends in pajamas. Yep, got some people. I'm telling you guys, man, I dress up for you every day, so it's all good. You can wear your pajamas. That's totally fine. So someday, maybe that day when we get together after I've had my baby and I can drink my wine, right? We can get together and we can all wear heels, and we can raise a glass of wine together. So there we go. We'll show off gastrocnemius. So gastrocnemius very much lives on the backside. Because it lives on the backside, we can predict. You don't own any, Eileen? I have like one pair, which actually, now that I think about it, I might have gotten rid of because when I wear it, I'm taller than my husband. So I like never wear heels. So yeah, plantar flexion is what we're going to do with gastrocnemius because it lives on the backside. Yeah, Carrie mentioned at some point in the pregnancy you stopped carrying. Yep. Full disclosure, when I'm done talking with you guys, I'm totally going to put on my yoga pants and my t-shirt. So I'll dress up for you in class, but then I'm going back to those comfy clothes too. It's real. Two muscles left here on my list with moving the foot. Fibularis longus and tibialis anterior. One of those muscles lives on the lateral side of the foot, or of the leg, excuse me. Lives on the lateral side of the leg. Who lives on the outside? Fibularis or tibialis? Yep, fibularis. Fibularis is the one that's on top of the fibula, which is your bone on the outside. Fibularis longus. So because it lives on the outside, like we've been doing with all of our other predictions, we know that it's does plantar flexion. Lives on the side. And the name gives it away for tibialis anterior, right? Anterior means we're on the anterior side, we're on the front. And your muscles that live on the front do dorsiflexion. All right, so let me check. I think there is there one more movement? I don't want to click away from this slide. Do we ask you to do inversion and eversion? No. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Okay, so here's what I'll say then in closing, in reminder here with our movement stuff. Number one, we are not memorizing the specific movements of these muscles. Do not waste your memorized space on the specific movements of these muscles. What we are memorizing, number two, what we are memorizing are those rules that you find at the top of each section. We want to know if you live on the anterior side, if you live on the posterior side, if you live on the lateral or the medial side. We want to know which action word goes with those locations. So do not memorize the specific actions. Do memorize the general actions. The general actions being, like we see on this page, up here at the top. Do memorize this stuff. Use that stuff to practice predicting what the actions are. I know I mentioned this in class with some of my labs, but not everyone has lab with me. On the final exam, I'm going to give you a totally bogus, made-up muscle that doesn't exist, and I'm going to ask you what action it does. The way that you can answer a question like that is using those rules. So if I completely make up a muscle that there's no way for you to have memorized what it does, can you tell me that, oh, because it lives on the front side, it's going to do dorsiflexion? Or, oh, because it lives on the back side, it's going to do plantar flexion. So I will ask you to use these rules with a few made-up muscles, but I will also ask you to use these rules with some muscles that aren't with the muscles that you're learning here. So we're going to have to tie together the location of these muscles with what it is that they do. So Rose asks, if it doesn't exist, how do we know if it's posterior or anterior? I will give you a picture of it. Yeah, I should have clarified that a little better. Here, my skeleton friend is so big. Let me pull up my skeleton friend here. So here's my skeleton friend. He can wave hi a little bit better. So good morning from the skeleton. What I would do for a question like this on the exam is I would show you, I've got a muscle maybe that starts here and it goes right here. So I'd make up a muscle and I'd put it right here. And I would ask you, what does this muscle do to the tibia? It's a muscle that lives right here and it attaches to the tibia down here. That means this is a muscle that lives on the front side, because I can see we're on the front side of my skeleton. If this muscle lives on the anterior side of the thigh, what do muscles that live on the anterior side of the thigh do to the tibia? Can we remember what it does? If you're on the anterior side of the thigh, what do I do to the tibia? Yeah, I got some votes coming in. We probably need to review. Most of us, we're split, but several of us are that muscles that live on the anterior side of the thigh, they would extend the tibia. Here, let's go sideways. I got a muscle that lives up here. When the muscle that lives up here contracts, it makes the tibia go straight. Making the tibia go straight, that is the process of extension. Yeah, if I was asking you, Rosa mentions it with the femur, if I was asking you about how I move the femur, I've got a muscle that attaches, it would attach up here, let me move him down, attach up here on the hips and go down onto the front side of the femur, move his hand. If it attached right here and it went to the front side of the femur and I ask you what it did to the femur, it would do flexion of the femur because it's going to pull the femur up, flexion of the femur. So we're looking to see, am I moving the femur? Am I moving the tibia? That's what's going to help me to know which rule to use. What other questions do we have about that? Yeah, a couple of you are saying, oh, I thought something else. That's totally fine. We got practice, right? That's why we're practicing. And again, with your own body, when you get to those questions on the exam, you can feel those locations on your body. So if I have something that I've got a muscle that starts up here and it goes down here, I can feel those places on my body and I can see what it would look like if I kind of bring those things together. So feel free to use your body. We're going to use pictures on the skeleton for that one. Okay, well, let me move into origins and insertions, because that's the other major part of this packet that I think we should spend some time on. Here's the first thing for us to know with origins and insertions, something that I want you to write down on your paper somewhere. Two somethings to write down, actually, so let me help you with typing them out here. When we talk about muscles in your body, they always attach at two places. they're always going to attach at an origin and at an insertion. When I use the word origin, an origin is an attachment site, and let's see if anybody remembers this. Origins do or do not move. Does anyone remember? An origin is an attachment site that does or does not move. What do we think? Origins. Yeah, do not move. Origin does not move. This is the place where a muscle is going to attach to bones. When I do muscle movement, I always have to have a place that doesn't move. Otherwise, my skeleton would be going nuts. So origin is a place that does not move. We also have places called insertions. And so insertion by process of elimination means that it does move. An insertion does move. This is the moving site. When I do a muscle movement, what always happens when you contract muscle is the insertion always, if I could spell, always moves toward origin. Simplest, easiest way to think about muscle movements. When I have a muscle that contracts, the moving attachment site, the insertion, always moves closer to the origin. That's what we talk about with origins and insertions. So if you're a little rusty on the difference between an origin and an insertion, this would be something we want to write down and make sure that we know. Origins never move, insertions always move, and the insertions always move toward the origins. Give me a thumbs up if we feel okay so far. Origins, insertions, the way things move. Perfect. Okay. So I'm getting lots of thumbs or lots of yeses. Perfect. Okay. Excuse me. So with this activity, what you need to keep in mind with every part of this activity is that when I tell you that those bone markings are the origin of a muscle, this is going to be the place where the muscle attaches, no movement happens. There's no movement there. When I tell you these bone markings are my insertions, these are the places that are moving. So when I ask you to predict what's going to happen when this muscle contracts, you need to look at, or again, act out on yourself, what happens if I take those insertions and I bring closer to my origin. That's the goal of this activity, is to predict some of those actions based on my muscle locations. So we're going to work on a couple of these together. This is going to tie in some of those bone markings. So a couple of us mentioned that the bone markings are tough, and I do not disagree. Bone markings are things that we just have to memorize. And the way that you memorize stuff is by looking at it again and again and again. I will mention that in the student Google Drive, in the helpful websites document, we don't usually reference that one a lot, but in the helpful websites document, I know they've got quizzing links there. So if you learn best by quizzing yourself, please look into that, because it'll have a little leader line that goes to a bone marking and asks you to identify it and have a list for you. You also have the homework assignments to help with that too, but if you want to save those homework assignment attempts, right, for your sake of the grade in class, that quizzing is available for you as well. So check that out. That's in the student Google Drive, helpful websites. Let me see what our options are here. Adductor group and gluteus maximus. Let's do adductor together. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here. For this activity, we recommend that you use 3 different colored pens, pencils, markers, whatever. If you don't have those sitting around your house, which I totally understand, you don't need multiple colors. So we're going to use the multiple colors in here to help us do the origin and insertion activities. You don't have to. You could do it all in one color. Leslie asked about the number of attempts on the lab homework. That is correct. Lab homework is still 3 attempts, but the lecture homework is unlimited attempts. That is correct. So 3 attempts for lab, unlimited attempts for lecture. All right, so for this activity, The colors that we recommend you consider using are red to show you your muscles, blue to show you your origins, and green to show you your insertions. So I'll do a little color coding here. Hey, remind me, start labeling my bone markings. So we got green for insertions, we got blue for origins here. When I start labeling these bone markings, which of the bone markings is going to be the blue ones or the green ones? Which of those are going to be the ones that actually move? The blue ones or the green ones? Which markings are going to move? Yeah, I'm getting some votes coming in. Yep, the green ones are going to be the bone markings that move. The green ones are representing the insertions. Okay, so first step of this process, and you could start with this one or you can come back to it later. First thing that you can do is draw for yourself generally where the muscle is located. So notice my first step here says to draw the adductor group. I'm actually going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to come back to where the adductor group is, because I'm going to draw my origin and insertion first and then kind of connect the dots. But here's just a friendly reminder for you. I'm going to pull my muscle man down here. The adductor group, blow up my chat for me, was adductor lateral or medial? Does anyone remember where I found the adductor group? Was that toward the middle or toward the outside? I got a few votes coming in. Most of us are voting that it is a medial muscle. That's correct. That's a medial muscle. Make sure I point to the right one here for you. This is my big adductor group that we talked about. So the adductor group found here in the middle. It's going to start on the hip bones and it's going to go down into the femur. So generally, this is my location of the adductor group. So we're going to keep that in mind when we're trying to figure out where in the world the bone markings are that we are labeling as our origins and our insertions. So let's pull out, I'm going to change colors to blue here. I'm going to start with my origins. So my origins, remember, are the places that do not move when this muscle contracts. When I talk about the origin of the adductor group, I just have one. This one origin is called the ischial tuberosity of the ischium. Now, the ischial tuberosity of the ischium was a bone marking that we actually learned before spring break, or that we were completing on the homework that you've hopefully done the week 8 homework. The ischial tuberosity is actually what you sit on when you're sitting down. So right now you're probably resting on your ischial tuberosity. Your nerd teacher sometimes likes to joke with her husband that her ischial tuberosity is sore. True story. So I am that nerdy. So ischial tuberosity, when I am looking at my hip bones here, let me change color. There are 3 bones of the hip. This one here at the top, does anyone happen to remember the name of the one at the very top? When you put your hands on your hips, this is the bone you're touching up here. Yeah, the ilium. The ilium is the big bone that you put your hands on at the top, absolutely. The way I like to remember the ischium is just generally this is the bone that you sit on. So back here, I'll try not to get in the way of our labeling later here. This one back here more, this guy is called the ischium. That's the bone we're looking for. We've got to find the ischial tuberosity. And it's a little hard to see because we're looking at the back side of the pelvis here, but the very front part, the bones in the front, so not my little coccyx, not this little guy that's right here, that's the coccyx, not the sacrum. Those are the 2 big bones on the back side. The bone in the front of the hips is called the pubis. They're in the front. So when we talk about the hip bones, there's the ilium on the top where you put your hands when you're putting your hands on your hips. The ischium here in the back, which is what we sit on, and the pubis, which is in the front, that connects the 2 halves of the pelvis together. So we are looking for something called the ischial tuberosity. When you were learning your bone marking words, here's a friendly reminder for us. The word tuberosity, does anyone happen to remember what general group tuberosity fit into? What I mean by that is things like hole or indentation or projection or an edge. a tuberosity. Yeah, so I got a couple different votes here. I got votes for whole. I got votes for projection. Yeah, generally when we talk about tuberosities, that's going to be in that category that was like a line, a projection, or a bump. A tuberosity, the word by itself, typically means that it's a bump of some kind, a tuberosity. And when you're looking at our ilium bone, or ischium bone, excuse me, that we sit on back here, this flat part down here on the bottom, this flat part here on the bottom is the ischial tuberosity. It's the bump, the ischial tuberosity. Let me label it in blue. This is going to be the area where my adductor group starts. This is my attachment site that does not move. It's my origin, the ischial tuberosity of the ischium bone. So I've marked, just like my second part of this activity says to do, I have marked the location of that bone marking. If, by the way, you're looking at these origins and insertions and you don't know where a particular bone marking is, that's kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge for you that, hey, I probably need to make sure that I go back and figure out where this is. The reason we're learning bone markings is because they are the attachment sites for muscles. So the ischial tuberosity is the bump where specifically one muscle that attaches there is the adductor group. So we have labeled our origin, our non-moving attachment site. Now we need to label our insertion. Our insertion is our moving attachment site. So let me get my pencil back here. When I look at what my insertion is, this is something called the linea aspera on the femur. Linea aspera actually has the word line inside of it. So when you're looking, I can't zoom in any closer, but when you're looking at your picture here, there's a line that goes kind of along the back side of the femur here. Linea aspera right here. So I've highlighted the green space, and I apologize, that green is kind of light, but my green space right here, that's my linea aspera. That's the insertion of my muscle. I've highlighted that in green, my moving color. The origin of my muscle I've highlighted in blue, the ischial tuberosity. Remember, a tuberosity is a bump. So I have marked the origin. I have marked the insertion of my muscle. Now what I'd say to do is to go back and connect the dots. So I'm going to switch colors one last time, and I'm going to attach my origin to my insertion. I've just done a terrible job of drawing, but have drawn nonetheless the general location of the adductor group. So remember, that was the one that we said we could see peaking on the thigh, peaking at an angle there. So I've identified the attachment sites that don't move. I've identified the attachment sites that move. The last part of this activity is part number 4, where we are predicting the action of this muscle. Now, remember, anytime a muscle contracts, it always moves its insertion toward its origin. So what we've just drawn on our skeleton is the insertion and the origin of the muscle. We've labeled them in different colors. So when I'm looking at this muscle, my insertion is out here on the femur. My origin is here on the hip bone. My insertion moves toward my origin. I'm going to pull the femur, this attachment site over here, I'm going to pull that toward the hip bones, toward the ischium over here, because that's where my origin is at. So when I'm looking at my 2 options here for which kind of action this muscle might do, help me out. Based on its origin and its insertion, are we going away from or toward the middle of the body? Based on that insertion moving toward the origin. Yeah, we're going toward the midline of the body. Absolutely. So for the adductor group muscle, my action is going to be that this is going to pull the femur toward the middle of the body. It pulls the femur toward the middle. Now remember that bogus muscle that I told you I was going to make up on the final exam, this is what you're going to see. It's going to be exactly like this. So that bogus muscle, let me pull up my skeleton friend again. That bogus muscle that I said I was gonna have attached here, and I was gonna have attached here, I'm going to have the blue, I'm gonna label this site up here as the origin, and I'm gonna label this site down here as the insertion, and I'm gonna ask you what it does. When my insertion moves toward my origin, it flattens out my femur, like we were talking about. Here's my insertion right here, and my origin is up here. When I pull them together, we know that that's called extension of the tibia. So those bogus muscles I'm going to make up, I'm going to tell you, hey, by the way, here's the place that does move, and here's the place that doesn't move. I can use that, and I can use those rules that I memorized to predict what these muscles in the body do. I want to know, now that we've done one of these practice activities, what questions we have right now about origins, insertions, and predicting actions. What questions we have right now. Or alternately, if you're feeling good, give me a thumbs up. So let me know what questions we have, or give me a thumbs up. Yeah, I think Carrie said, I think it's just going to take time. Absolutely. It is definitely just going to take time. You have in this particular lab packet several of these activities to do. So we just did one of them together. We did the adductor group together where we drew on the origin and the insertion, and we pretended to pull those parts together. So you've got lots of activities. Next door neighbor to it is asking you about gluteus maximus. So we're going to work on gluteus maximus. And on the next page, you've got some more muscles that are on the front side to do these things with. So it's definitely going to take time. And what I would tell you guys if we were in class together is that absolutely this is something that we just have to work on consistently every week between now and the final exam. It's just going through with these activities, pulling together the bone markings with potential muscle movements. Absolutely. It's going to take time. It is a lot. I do not disagree with you. Practice, practice, practice. That would have been true if we were in class together, or now where we're online together in the class. That doesn't change. Absolutely. I know Lexi's mentioning she has a question about something else in the packet. I will take that question in just a minute. I know earlier we had asked about our classifications of neurons too, so we'll take some time to do that. Any last minute questions about this origin and insertion thing? So the origin of the gluteus is on 3 bones. Yeah, so when you start working on the next one, notice that the gluteus, I'll zoom in a little bit here. Gluteus maximus has more than one insertion, absolutely. So, or more than one origin, excuse me. So with having those more than one origin, we're going to want to highlight all of those locations. This is where it could be helpful for something like gluteus maximus. It might be helpful to draw the muscle on first to get an idea of where that muscle is, because then we can label the parts that are attached to the ilium and the sacrum and the coccyx. We can label one insertion, though they will generally all be close to each other, definitely. All right, well, so Leslie asked me to repeat. So really all I said is just check for the 3. So sometimes there is more than one origin or more than one insertion. If that's the case, maybe draw your muscle on first and then label the part that's connected to those origins and insertions. Label that after you've drawn the muscle on. If there's more than one attachment site, it might help to see that muscle first to help you identify where those sites are. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, well, in the last bit of time that we have here, we want to talk about structure and functional classifications. So I'm going to do that. Let me go to my slides here. And hey, what I'll say to you guys is all of our working here on the origin and insertion stuff, if we were in class, I definitely would not have been able to talk with you about this stuff very much at all. So I know like everything else about being online is super sucky, right? But we just got to spend like an hour and a half talking about origins and insertions and identifying muscles. If we were in class, if you guys remember from the week before spring break, how I told you we're going to get like 15 minutes for the second part of the packet. This is that part of the packet we would have spent like 15 minutes on. So the one silver lining of going on is we just really got to kill this activity, right? We really got to walk through it. So one benefit to being online, the only benefit, right? Okay. Let me pull up, let's go here. All right. So when we are talking about the types of neurons in the body, there are two ways to classify them. The first way that we can classify them, and the way that's going to be most important probably for lab, is their structure or their shape. So when we talk about the shapes that I have of neurons in the body, the three shapes that we have of neurons in the body, they're called unipolar, they are called bipolar, and they are called multipolar. Oops, here we go. Each of these words that you see here it includes this ending part polar on them. That's kind of a tip-off for you. The word polar basically means the number of things that come off of the cell body of a neuron. So here's a friendly reminder when we're talking about neurons, and I'm going to make you do this when you start working on lesson number 10, is start practicing drawing neurons. Remember, my friends that have come to earlier office hours know that you don't have to draw pretty to get the point across. The typical kind of neurons that we like to draw are going to look like this. So here's the kind of art that I expect you to do in your lesson number 9 notes, or number 10 notes when you're talking about neurons. It's nothing fancy. The parts we have to know on a neuron, somebody help me out with which page we're on. Was it around page 5, I think someone was saying? Yep, there we go, page 4. Okay, so we're on page 4. You should have these exact pictures. I'm doing some freehand art over here that's not necessarily on any of your pages. So just doing a little freehand art over here. When we talk about a neuron, the big things that all of our sketches need to have in them, and it's all it needs to have in them. The first thing it needs to have are all these little things that come off my neurons over here. These little things that come off my neurons are called dendrites. Dendrites are the places where my neurons receive messages. So when you draw yourself a sketch of a simple neuron, actually here, we're gonna whiteboard it. Sorry. We're gonna start over because I just love drawing neurons so much. So here we go. I'm gonna draw myself a new neuron. We'll go back to that page. Here's all you have to draw when I ask you in your notes packet to draw yourself a neuron. Here's what your neuron should look like. Okay, so we just talked about these guys, these little parts right here that stick off. These little part right here that sticks out are called dendrites. Dendrites are the places where a neuron receives messages. So we always want to make sure when we draw our neurons, we give them plenty of places to receive messages. We also have this big circle part that we drew, that we put the dark thing in the middle here. This is the part called the cell body, or called, you'll see it sometimes called in the videos, the soma. The cell body is kind of the thinking part of our neuron, where it has all of its organelles. We also then have this part next to it, the little triangle part. That arrow didn't go needed to go. But that part there is called the axon hillock. The axon hillock is a place that my neuron, you're going to learn about this in lesson number 10. This is where my neuron figures out whether or not it should send a message to its neighboring neurons. If it decides that it should be sending a message, it's going to send that message down this long extension here called the axon. And at the very end of the axon, we have these little places down here, multiple different names for them. The name we're going to use in lecture is what we call the axon terminals. I like that name because it means the end of an axon. So axon terminals. Whenever you see in your lecture notes that I ask you to draw a neuron, which I'm going to do 2 or 3 times when you're doing lesson number 10, this is all you have to draw on it. It doesn't have to be this pretty. Well, actually, this isn't super pretty, but it doesn't have to be super detailed. This is the kind of stuff that we want to see on our neurons. So when we talk about those 3 words that we were using before, unipolar, oh, interesting. That's not what I meant to do. Can you just see my video, or can you see my whiteboard too? Can we all still see the whiteboard? Yes, okay. Sorry, my computer's like, everyone can now see your video. It's like, okay, I hope it's not just my video. Perfect, okay. Unipolar, bipolar, multipolar. When we use these words to describe the shape of a neuron, what we are talking about is the number of things that attach to the cell body. That's what that polar word means. The number of things that attach to the cell body. So we've got unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. Not a trick question. When we're talking unipolar, how many things do we think attach to the cell body of unipolar? Yeah, uni means one. A unicycle has one wheel. So unipolar, there's going to be one thing attached to the cell body. When we talk about bipolar, how many things are going to be attached to the cell body for bipolar? Yeah, exactly. Bi means 2. Bicycle has 2 wheels, 2. Multipolar just means I have more than 2. We have a lot, multiple. So when we talk about structural classifications of neurons, your options are it has one thing attached to its cell body. I'd call that a unipolar neuron. It has 2 things attached to its cell body. That's bipolar. Or it has many things attached to its cell body. That's called multipolar. So these are the structural classification words that I use when I'm talking about neurons. So let me go back to the picture where we started. When we are looking at our neurons, the part that represents in these pictures the cell bodies are the circles here. So in the very middle, I can see this dark gray nucleus portion. I can see my dark gray nucleus portion in my cell body, and then I got a nucleus in my cell body up here. When I look at my first neuron here on the left, I can see an extension in the top coming off of this cell body, and I can see another extension in the bottom coming off of this cell body. Which of those polar words, those structural classification words, would I use for this first neuron over here? Exactly. Yep, a bunch of us are chiming in. This would be the bipolar neuron. It has 2 extensions, one on each side coming off of it. Hey, here's something that you should put in your notes for yourself, something I want you to write down. When I talk about bipolar neurons, these are mostly involved in special senses. Write down that bipolar neurons are in special senses. The very last thing we're going to study together is going to be things like smell and taste and vision. Bipolar cells involved in those special senses. Smell, taste, vision, that kind of stuff. My neuron here in the middle, I've got the cell body, but I only have one extension that comes off of the cell body. So what do we got here? Yep, a couple of us chiming in. This would be my unipolar neuron. There's just one extension coming off of the cell body for this neuron. Here's the note that you should make for yourself about unipolar neurons. Unipolar neurons usually are going to be just sensory neurons. So general sensory neurons. This is things like, how hot is it outside? This is things like, oh, my desk is really bumpy. So texture, temperature, stretching, that's the kind of things that these sensory neurons that are unipolar would detect for us. So by process of elimination, what I'm looking at right here, my last kind of neuron over here, it has lots of things attached to it. I've got an attachment over here and up here, all around. Yep, lots of things coming off of the cell body. If I have lots of things coming off of the cell body, that's going to make me a multipolar neuron. And I can't really predict the function of these multipolar neurons because they can do a lot of different things in the body. The two main kinds of things that they do, though, multipolar neurons can be what we call interneurons. Interneurons we're going to learn about in lesson number 10. They do a process called integration. Integration is basically figuring out what a neuron should be doing, integration. That's the job of an interneuron. The other kind of neuron, though, that a multipolar neuron could be is a motor neuron. Can anyone help me out? What do motor neurons do? Do we remember what motor neurons do? They actually relate to, oops, we got some feedback. They actually relate to what we're learning about in lesson number 9. Yeah, motor neurons send messages. They actually send messages to one particular type of cells, typically. Talking about in lesson number 9, or what kind of tissue is lesson number 9 all about? Our lecture stuff. What are we learning about in lecture right now? Yeah, there we go. Muscles. Exactly. When I talk about motor neurons, these guys activate muscle. Motor neurons activate muscle, typically. So my neurons over here, my bipolar neurons, they were special senses. My unipolar neurons, they're what we call general senses. And my other neurons are, my multipolar neurons could be interneurons or motor neurons. Okay, so here's the last thing we will look at. Yeah, it could be smooth muscle as well. Absolutely, could be smooth muscle. It could also even be things like, sorry, my mind is having trouble here. Could also be things like the endocrine system. So it could be that a motor neuron goes and tells the body to spit out a hormone. Motor neurons make stuff happen, generally speaking. Here's where we're going to end today. Last thing I'm going to do with you here today. When we talk about neurons, we have those two ways to classify them that we were just talking about. So when we're talking about neurons, first we can classify them structurally. Maybe here would be a note for you to make for yourself next to this picture. When you see the word structural classification, you should be thinking a polar word. And what I mean by that, by a polar word, is unipolar, bipolar, multipolar. Anytime we ask you for a structural classification, you should always tell me if it's unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar. That's what I mean by structural classification. When we talk about functional classifications, and again, this is something you're going to dive into more in lesson number 10, our next lecture lesson. My functional classifications of neurons, we have what we just talked about. So we've got motor neurons, we have sensory neurons, and we have interneurons. Those are my 3 functional classifications. So when you're completing this activity, you are wanting to put in our structural classification categories, that's going to be the number of extensions off of the cell body. For each of these neurons, I can look at them, and based on their shape, I can figure out how I would classify them, which polar word. For my functional classification of each of these neurons, functional classification of these neurons are these groups right here. Is it a sensory neuron? Is it a motor neuron? Is it an interneuron? So let's do a few of these things together. I'm going to start a little bit backwards, or kind of in the middle of your picture here. I want to start with this neuron right here. So I guess the arrow is up here, isn't it? So this neuron right here, we're going to start with our orange neuron here. This orange neuron right here, if you trace down axon, the long extension coming off of it, if you trace down its axon here in orange, this neuron goes all the way out to a muscle and tells that muscle to contract. When we were talking about our functional classifications of neurons, which kind of neuron talks to muscles and tells them to contract? Who did we say did that? Yeah, I got some votes coming in here. When I talk about my neurons that can talk to muscle tissue, or we said they could talk to endocrine tissue, for example, those are going to be my motor neurons. So in my chart here, I can write that this is a motor neuron. I know that this orange neuron is a motor neuron because it's talking to a muscle. There's a muscle here at the end. This is a motor neuron. But when I look at this neuron, I can also make a prediction about its structural classification. Remember, when we talked about structural classifications, that's always going to be a polar word. So it tells me how many things come off of it. Here's my cell body. I've got my axon that comes off, and then I've got these little branching dendrites that are off of it. This neuron has many extensions off of its cell body. What structural classification would I give this? Exactly. Yep. We're chiming in. This is an example of a multipolar neuron. This is a multipolar, can't spell, multipolar neuron right here. Absolutely. I have another neuron in this picture that is also multipolar. Is that neuron yellow or green? What's the other one that is multipolar? Can we tell from looking at it? Yellow or green? Yeah, I'm getting my votes in here. My green one that I can see right here, I also have an axon coming off of that, and I have multiple dendrites that are coming off of it as well. This green one here in the middle is also a multipolar neuron. When you look at this neuron over here, here's my cell body, this circle. Notice that there's just one extension that comes off of the cell body over here. So this neuron here in yellow, what would be my structural classification for this one over here? It has one extension. Exactly. Yep. I have one extension off that one, which is going to make this one over here a unipolar neuron. There's just one extension coming off of it. I told you when we talked about unipolar neurons that they all usually have the same kind of functional classification. They all have the same kind of job. Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in. Unipolar neurons are always sensory neurons. Exactly. Now, if I wasn't using the shape of this neuron to predict that it was a sensory neuron, the other way I could tell that this yellow one was a sensory neuron is if you trace its big long axon. Oh, let me get my pointer back here. Trace its big long axon here, all the way down in yellow. It goes all the way to the skin. This is showing me the skin. So all of these little extensions down here at the end are my dendrites, where I'm picking up information from the skin. So this is a sensory neuron. It's collecting information from the skin. I know it's sensory, both because it starts in the skin, but also because it is unipolar. There's one extension that comes off of it. So, so this neuron is a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron detects information. The sensory neuron brings its information to the multipolar neuron that we see here inside the spinal cord. This multipolar neuron here in the spinal cord is the kind of neuron that does what we call integration, or does processing. What was the name of the type of neuron that we said, the functional classification of the neurons that do integration or do processing? Who does that? Yeah, those interneurons. Absolutely. So the last part that we hadn't filled in yet was that this one up here, this is my interneuron. I didn't mark it. I know you all marked it for me. My structural classification of my interneuron. What was my structural classification? My polar word on this one. Yeah, exactly. Multipolar. All right. We are officially out of time for today. What I will mention is that tomorrow's office hours are kind of a free-for-all. If you have lab questions I didn't get a chance to answer during today's lab session, if you have specific lecture questions that I have not answered during our lecture office hours, please bring those questions to me tomorrow. I have no scheduled plan for tomorrow except to help you guys wrap up any last minute questions that you have. Nicole asked if I could repeat what the interneuron does. The word that we used for what an interneuron does is we call it integration. Integration, or in easy person words, we call it processing. Interneurons are my processing neurons. And you'll read some more about those in lesson number 10. Our next lecture lesson is posted for you. So I'll open the floor for any quick questions really fast, mainly just focusing on what we've spent our time on today. If you have other topics you want me to discuss, I'd be happy to do that tomorrow. Okay, so Pilar, it doesn't match exactly, which means I'm going to be that mean teacher that's going to ask you to try to do some critical thinking. We want to find the description that sounds the most like I'm processing, the most like I'm using a bunch of information to figure out what I should do with it. So if it doesn't match those words, find something that sounds the closest. Why are you not surprised, right? Yeah, see, I'm telling you, you guys realize that when we go through, hopefully you're seeing when we do our guided lessons or do our lab stuff, you're realizing, man, she was a little meaner than I thought she was. Not mean in a bad way. Hopefully we're good. Yeah, there is a video that explains it as well. Yep. So check out those videos. And there's one in the lab lesson, I know, and there's definitely some in the lecture lesson too, because we're moving into neurons in lecture. You're welcome. Yes, you're welcome. Yes, you have a wonderful day too, Leslie, and everybody else. Again, please bring questions tomorrow. Here's what I'll say for you in closing. What we need to make sure we remember, Friday lab friends, if you have not already submitted Anatomy for Babies, that is due tomorrow morning at 9:30. Please, somebody from Friday Lab, send out a message to your friends in GroupMe to remind them. I need them to submit Anatomy for Babies by 9:30 tomorrow morning. Everybody else, what we need to be focusing on, make sure that you have wrapped up. If you have not already, this only applies to Friday Lab, but Friday Lab friends, make sure you've done that week 8 homework. I hope that was done several days ago. Week 8 lab homework, got to be done. Everybody else, we are doing lesson number 9 homework, and we are doing week 11 lab homework. Those are the two things that we're focusing on. Week 11 lab, lesson number 9, those are both due Sunday night. So please do not forget that due date. I'll try to get you an announcement posted that reminds you of that as well. So bring your questions tomorrow. I will be here 9:30 to 11:30 tomorrow, and we will work our way through that stuff. So I'm going to end our recording, but I'll stick around for questions as we have those. So let me get that recording stopped. Oh dear. Sorry to my recording friends, it's being weird. Let me turn off my camera and my mic really fast. Yes, thank you to all of you guys as well. Nicole asked if it's week 11. The lab packet says week 10, but it is that is correct.